Dr. Elisabetta, on behalf of Team DAATH VOYAGE, it's an absolute pleasure to have you today. Just about Dr. Elisabetta, if I speak, it'll be at length, but I'll just try to give some gist of what she has done so far. She is presently an associate professor of English literature at the University of Rome. She has published extensively on travel literature, on English Romantic writers, on Italian American literature, Asian American and Asian British literature. She has been teaching both English and American literature for over more than 2 decades now. And she writes on mythology also, mythological dramas also. Her important collection, the collection of essays which she co-edited with Daniela, entitled The Partition of India. Many of you all might not know because she specializes in romantic and American literature, but she has worked on partition literature also of India. And in 2019, she also co-edited a book called Difference in Peace and Conflict, Mapping American Perceptions of Alterity in Literature, Culture, History. And she is widely published in various national and international journals. She is widely invited all over to deliver lectures at very prestigious platforms, be it FDPs, be it various academic endeavors. She has now I am completely sure about it. She has a very soft corner for India and Indian academics, and it is always a pleasure to have her. Without wasting much time, Dr. Elisabetta, on behalf of Team DAATH VOYAGE, on behalf of myself and the lady behind the brain that is of this course, my colleague, Dr. Basudhara Roy, I heartily welcome you. The platform is all yours, ma'am. You are not audible. Yes. I think there's some issue.
Inviting me to share some ideas and thoughts with all of you. Now, I'm going to give you an overview, and as usual, there will be a lot of time, I think, for questions at the end. So I will talk for 1 hour and 1 hour and a half, and then I'm here for you to answer all your questions. Now, the title of my talk, as you can read, is The Age of Transition, Romantic Interventions Within Classical Framework. Basically, we are going to cover the time span between the second half of the 18th century and the beginning, I would say, of the first 2 decades of the 19th century. But now somebody is writing on this, on the PowerPoint like before. So I got,
Yeah,
you see,
so I think the same
never
thing has to be
mind.
done. I think the same thing has to be done.
Important for all the pre-romantic writers. In many cultural factors and many historical factors. George III was known as the king of the 3 revolutions, as you can see. And in the PowerPoint, you can see a picture of George III. You know, the stately figure, the king of England, the first of the Hanover family, who actually was born in England, because George I and George II were not born in England and did not live in England. So George III marked a new beginning of history. Now, as I told you, he was regarded as the king of the 3 revolutions because 3 revolutions took place during his very long reign. First of all, the Industrial Revolution. And this is very important because the landscape during his reign changed dramatically. The countryside started to be replaced by new industrial areas where factories were born. And therefore, people started to move from the countryside to the city, to the neighborhood where all the factories were. And therefore, there started to be some even environmental problems which will be dealt with also by Mary Shelley. And probably in the final part of my talk, I will give you some insights of that. So the problem of nature and the core problem dealt with by many romantic writers, that is the relationship between man and nature, also stemmed from the fact that starting with the reign of George III, nature became progressively replaced by factories, by industrial neighborhoods, and therefore there was a violation of nature. First revolution. Second revolution, the American Revolution. The American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence in 1776. So basically, America used to be a colony for Britain, and Britain lost the American colony in 1776. There were mixed opinions on this factor. Some people were not at all disappointed by the fact that America no longer belonged to Great Britain. Why is that? Because they had realized that America did not have so many goods, so many raw materials as it was expected. And therefore, many intellectuals decided to push the king not to invest too much on retaining America as a colony. Therefore, the American independence, yes, was a brilliant result for the Americans, but also because the British did not invest very much in this war. Why? Because they started instead to invest a lot of money, expertise, efforts towards Asia and especially towards India. So basically, in the reign of George III, the basis of the colonial empire, which will see its light during the reign of Queen Victoria in 1876, will be, will be founded. Okay, so basically all the efforts were moved from America to India. So, second revolution. The third revolution was the French Revolution, which happened in the period of George III. The French Revolution had a huge impact on Britain, much more than the American Revolution, even though England was not connected from any point of view. France was not a colony, but the impact on England was dramatic, was tremendous. And I will explain to you why. If you think of geography, America was really far away from the UK. And therefore, whatever happened there did not have much resonance, much of an impact on the UK. Conversely, France was really close to Great Britain. You know, there is a very short distance between France and the UK. And therefore, George III was terrified by the fact that the King of France had been beheaded. So he was terrified that something like that may happen in Britain as well. Okay, so the impact of the French Revolution was dramatic on England. The king, therefore, started to use a system of espionage, basically to try to monitor the whole of the situation. The king of George III was a kingdom of terror. Okay, a kingdom of terror, of espionage, of yes men, of corruption, of bribing, and George III wanted to control everything. Okay, so he was the king of the three revolutions. He was also the king of the Regulating Act. And when I speak about regulating act, I speak of what happened in India in this period. As you know, India was not a colony in those days, but the East India Company had some premises and some territories in India, especially around Calcutta. Okay, so the king was also very much concerned because the East India Company was very independent. It was a commercial company. The trade was essentially the trade of tea, of expensive goods, of spices, and the king was really concerned because he could not rule over the East India Company. Therefore, he issued the Regulating Act in 1773. The Regulating Act contemplated that the East India Company could choose the governor of its lands, of the lands that the East India Company ruled over, but this governor had to be, had to have an entourage, a group of supporters, and this group was appointed directly by the king. So the four people appointed by the king, in actual fact, controlled the governor appointed by the East India Company. Moreover, there is another issue that you can add to this. Moreover, the whole system of justice was a system of justice that used judges and lawyers from England. Therefore, only formally the East India Company ruled over India, over the territories around Calcutta that the East India Company had. But in practice, the king was ruling also in India. So, Revolution Regulating Act. Now, as I told you, the kingdom of George III was very controversial. The king himself was a very controversial man. Rumors say that he was not able to read until he was 11. So he had some cognitive problems, actually. And in actual fact, as time passed by, he developed a disease that was typical of the Hanover family. The disease was called porphyria. Porphyria. It was a blood disease. Many red corpuscles, red globules, can bring oxygen to the brain. So there is lack of oxygen to the brain, and therefore the signs of madness actually develop. So the king at a certain moment was incapable of ruling. He was completely mad. He used to go around at times even naked. He used to play jokes to everybody. Sometimes he fell asleep in the middle of a meeting because not much oxygen arrived to his brain. Therefore, they decided to appoint a regent king, which was not really the king because the king was still alive. He was the prince, the future George IV, and he acted as if he was the king of England, but he was not yet the king. This period of extreme instability is called the Regency period. And it spans from 1811, as you can see, to 1820. And this is the period when most of the Romantic writings, most of the most important Romantic artists developed their art. So it was a period of crisis from the point of view of politics, but it was also a very fertile period from a cultural point of view. Probably because the king was mad. And I will explain it to you. The king wanted to rule over everything. He wanted also to control art, okay? To control the artists. Why? Because the artists always bring about the most revolutionary ideas, okay? This is the reason why he founded in 1768 the Royal Academy of Arts, which you can see. I put a picture of the Royal Academy of Arts in the slide. As you can see, there are a lot of people looking at hundreds and hundreds of paintings that are hung in the same room. Why the Royal Academy of Arts, and why did the king decide to control the art through an academy? Because the only principle of the Royal Academy of Arts was that nobody can create anything. Art has to be nothing but imitation of works of the past. So basically, in the Royal Academy of Arts, which was the most important Academy of Arts for the whole of the 18th and even the 19th century, all the artists didn't learn how to develop their own art. They learned only how to copy the art of the Renaissance, to copy the works of Titian, Raphael, Michelangelo, and so on and so forth, because by copying the past, they could not introduce new ideas in the present. Okay? So this is probably the reason why in the Regency period, when the king was mad and the king was not trying to control everything like he used to do, all the arts developed. All the artists tried to bloom and publish and renew ideas and renew society. Because the pre-romantic, the so-called romantic art is so much engrossed, is so much involved in the ideas of renewal and regeneration, which was not possible when the king was alive and when the Royal Academy imposed its own standard over all artists. Now, now, before delving into the art of this very controversial period, a period in which still there are classical tendencies, but also aspirations to renewal, I want to give you some groundbreaking implications, groundbreaking treatises and publications of this period. First of all, The Social Contract by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which changes the idea of men and society and invites people to ponder on the relationship between men and society. Rousseau honestly believed that men, when they are born good and proper and innocent. Okay, it is just the fact that they live together in a society that corrupts them. This idea was a very, very seminal idea. Now, Psychiat prompted me to insert here and there some bits and pieces of Mary Shelley. Actually, the creature created by Dr. Frankenstein absolutely obeys to the ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Because the creature, when it was created by Victor Frankenstein, was good, was innocent. He was a very naive creature. He was vegetarian. The creature does not eat animals. The creature only eats berries taken from the trees. Okay? It is only when the creature enters society And when society judges the creature by its appearance, that he becomes a monster. So the social contract actually states this: man is good, man in nature is good, man in society, which means men's in the city, and the city means factories, and factories mean pollution. In this context, men become bad. Okay, so this is the most important element of the social contract, and it has a seminal influence, a seminal impact on all romanticism. Second text: an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of the nation, 1776, Adam Smith. This text was also extremely seminal and intimately connected with the idea of the Industrial Revolution. Adam Smith aimed at productivity. He wanted his nation to prosper, to be wealthy. That's why it is called the wealth of the nations. Okay, so he realized that in order to produce very, very, very much, production has to be made in a sequence, like in a chain of production. So Adam Smith is the theorist of the production chain, which actually creates a scissor, a scission between the man and the products that he or she is trying to produce. Because men in a chain all produce and perform the same activity, the same activity, the same activity, and they never see the end of the process. If I want to produce, I don't know, a book, even a book, there are people who produce the paper, then people who cut the paper, then people who take all the leaves of paper together and bind it, then people who put the cover, then people who sell the book. So it is a chain of production. Whoever creates the book does not have the satisfaction of looking at the final product. It is an alienating activity. Chain production is alienating. So working in the factory is alienating. And Adam Smith was actually sacrificing the fact that the wellness of workers to the altar of mass production. But this is a very important essay because, for example, William Blake rebelled exactly to that, to the idea of chain production, mass production. And he used to say, we don't need to produce thousands of goods. We need to produce one, but perfect and unique. Okay? So this is another foundation text of this period. The third one is inquiry. Notice that there is always the idea of inquiry or inquiry. So the idea of investigating, because the 18th century is also the century of enlightenment and investigation. So inquiring concerning political justice by William Godwin, 1793. So William Godwin, who incidentally was the father of Mary Shelley, in this text wanted to stir people to use rationality. He wanted his fellow countrymen to be rational, okay? Because he believed that if men and women developed their own brain to the utmost, then people would be absolutely perfect. So he believed that by using the rational thought processing, men and women could even defeat diseases and become immortal. Obviously, this is a utopia, but this gives you an idea of the debates, the cultural debates of this very fertile period, even the clashing debate, because Rousseau said exactly the opposite as William Godwin. Rousseau celebrated the individual in nature. William Godwin celebrated rational individuals who worked together in the city. And again, Adam Smith celebrated mass production because mass production implied the fact that the country would become great and would prosper. So these are important reference points to understand the cultural debates of the period. Now, the Gothic novel and the Gothic genre, which is typical of architecture, of art, visual arts, and eventually of literature, is one of the most important genres of the 18th century. And it is also an anti-classical genre. So that's why when we talk about the age of transition, the Gothic genre is the first genre that comes to our mind, well before Romanticism. Because, okay, first of all, the Gothic genre developed in the second half of the 18th century, okay? So it is exactly in the same period, at the same time of classical Augustan, I would say, literature. So on the one hand, in the 18th century, we have classically inspired literature. The most important poet of this is Alexander Pope, for example, with perfect lines, everything tidy, everything in order, everything rhyming, everything neat. Okay, then on the other hand, we have the Gothic genre in the same period, which is the anti-classic. And to explain this clash to you, I'm going to start by looking at gardens, because actually classicism and Gothicism developed first of all in the architecture of gardens and only in a very secondary moment in literature. Now, if you look at the two pictures that I inserted in the slide, you can see the typical example of an Italian style garden and the typical example of a British style garden. The Italian style garden is the garden of also Versailles in France, of all the most important royal palaces, both in Italy and in France. As you can see, everything is symmetric, everything is organized, everything is in order. There is no element of chaos, because they wanted to convey the idea that in the kingdom there was no chaos. The king ruled over everything. Now, starting from the second half of the 18th century, the opposite tendency started to spread, also as a form of rebellion to the king, as a subtle form of rebellion. As I told you, George III wanted to rule over everything. He wanted to control everything. He had spies everywhere. He had his ministers and the police everywhere. Everybody was controlled and checked. So British gardeners and British architects of gardens started to create new forms of garden that defeated the idea of control. So in the British garden, as you can see, the British style garden, there is no symmetry. Everything is left apparently to chaos, but there is no real chaos because everything is ordered in its own way. So everything is manicured. If you see the lawn is manicured, is trimmed, is perfectly trimmed, but willingly it is not symmetric. So there is the idea of evading symmetry, of breaking boundaries, okay, the boundary of control and symmetry. It was also very much connected to the fact that in the 18th century, the Brits used to go to Italy, to France, to Switzerland for the Grand Tour, and also they used to steal pieces of marble from archaeological sites. So in this picture you cannot see it, but in many British style gardens, there were also ruins, architectural ruins taken or pillaged, I would say, from Italy and Spain. So that gave you an idea of more freedom, more liberty, less control, and more irrationality, okay? Because the Gothic style, the Gothic genre is also the genre of whatever is irrational. And from there, I will move to the Gothic style in visual arts. The first painting that you can see is a painting by Salvatore Rosa, an Italian painter. And you can see exactly what I told you. This is more or less also the prototype of a British style garden. There is the ruin, there is vegetation, the plants are not controlled the way they used to be controlled in Versailles or in Fontainebleau or in any royal palace in France or in Italy. So there is this fusion of nature, ruin, and chaos and irrational elements. If you see also the little figures, the little men, they are not as important as the architecture in itself. So men that used to be the center for the Enlightenment, for the classical period, man was the center of everything, now loses his centrality. Okay, this is very important. Man is no longer the center of the universe. Elements of chaos, elements of nature, elements of architecture, all blended, create a fusion, which in itself is the most important element. The second painting is a very famous one that I am sure every one of you knows. It is entitled The Nightmare, and the painter is Henry Fuseli, The Nightmare. And this is the celebration of man's irrationality. The nightmare is everything that we cannot control. We cannot control dreams, okay? So the irrational breaks into the rational. The Gothic breaks into the classic. And here in this picture, we have the classical beauty dressed in white, but over this beauty there is an incubus, a little devil that looms over her, that creates an imbalance in her classical perfection. The last picture is from another Italian, Giovanni Piranesi, and it is called The Prison of Invention, Le Carceri di Invenzione. And if you look at this picture, you can see the graphic representation of a Gothic novel. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Gothic novels in a minute, but here you can actually see the graphic representation of a Gothic novel. You see the darkness, you see the confusion, you see the little tiny human figures who are not central anymore. You see all these steps going up and down, and you see the chaos, the fear, the fact that you are lost, you don't know where to go. And the feeling that this picture conveys to the onlooker is a feeling of real anxiety. If you look at it, you feel anxious. It is a stifling setting, okay? It doesn't give you the idea of neatness and order. It only gives you the idea of chaos, of nightmarish chaos. Now, let's move to the Gothic novel and the main feature. So, as I started off, Gothic as an anti-classic started in the architecture of gardens, then in the visual arts, and then eventually in writing, in narratives, in Gothic novels. Now, the Gothic novel was a very, very, very popular genre. Many people enjoyed Gothic novels. Many people of all cultural extraction, from the upper classes to the lower classes. So it was a very, very famous and very popular genre. People enjoyed it very much because it was somehow a really reassuring genre. Okay, many of you might be puzzled by what I am saying, because when you think of Gothic, you don't think of something reassuring. You think of exactly the opposite. You think of a villain, you think of an impending threat, you think of a poor lady in distress. This is what you think of. But the Gothic novel was reassuring in the sense that it had usual patterns that go from order, violation of order, going back to order. Okay? So it was reassuring because whenever you started reading a Gothic novel, you knew exactly that at the end of it, the order would be restored. So it was perceived by the readership as an extremely cathartic, purifying novel, because all the anxieties, all the uncertainties that any person experiences in his or her life were somehow purified by this novel. The anxiety was cast over, was projected onto the novel, and you knew exactly that by the end of it, everything would be perfect, everything would be all right, the happy ending was absolutely assured, and even the personal anxieties would be overcome. Okay, so it was a way of projecting onto paper one's preoccupations, one's anxieties, knowing that they would find a solution, knowing that the solution would be there. So it was, as I told you, really cathartic as a way of reading. Now, the Gothic novel had always the same settings. And these settings were the so-called Orient and I am using the word Orient in the way Said uses the word Orient. So everything that is not Western was regarded as the Orient. So the Orient is Arab countries, India, whatever is not Western, okay? Or Catholic countries, such as Italy. Many Gothic novels were set in Italy, or Spain, and I'm going to explain to you why. Just a second, I'll sip at my tea. Now, if I have to project my anxiety onto paper, I have, first of all, to remove the object of anxiety from my own setting, okay? I cannot possibly think that everything that is upsetting is in England. So I have to remove almost surgically the sources of anxiety from England, and therefore the setting must be elsewhere, okay? Possibly in places which were associated with the ideas of anxiety for the British. Now, why the Orient and most of all India? Because many Gothic novels were set in India. Why is that? Because some years before, exactly in 1757, something had occurred in Calcutta to the officers of the East India Company at Fort Williams. What has passed on to history as the Black Hole of Calcutta. Basically, the white men, the British that were in Fort Williams had been sieged and then entrapped in one single room, and there were over 100 people in one single room, by the Nawab of Calcutta, one of the Nawabs of Calcutta, as a form of revenge, obviously, because the East India Company was taking their territories, and people had died, okay? They had died asphyxiated because of lack of oxygen. Think of over 140 people locked in a very tiny room of 4 meters by 5. Obviously, they were on top of one another, and there was only one window, and people died because of lack of oxygen. That became some kind of collective nightmare for the British. It was called the Black Hole of Calcutta. People died, and therefore, India was associated from now on, from that moment on, to a source of terror, to something that attracted, because India was attractive because of its natural beauties, but also because of its riches, but also something that repelled because of this collective nightmare. Then, why Catholic countries? Why Italy also? Because Italy was the setting of many Gothic novels. Because Italy was a Catholic country and still is a Catholic country. And starting from the Act of Supremacy, 1534, with Henry VIII separating Great Britain from Catholicism and founding the Anglican religion, everything that was Catholic was considered as the source of evil. Catholic people were persecuted in Britain, and they were tolerated more or less in the 18th century, but they could not hold any public work, any public job, any public position. Catholics were ostracized. So if we had to create the setting of a Gothic novel, cathartic, because I have to project onto that all my anxieties, I will do it in two lands which are considered as alien in comparison to Britain. The Orient, namely India, Catholic countries, namely Spain and Italy. If you think of Frankenstein, even though Frankenstein is not really a Gothic novel, Italy is very much present in Frankenstein. And in actual fact, we are told that Elisabetta Lavenza, Lavenza is an Italian surname, Elisabetta Lavenza, who is Victor Frankenstein's bride, was the daughter of an Italian patriot. So Italy is always there when monsters and when horror is dealt with. So the setting, set of characters. As I told you, in a Gothic novel, there is a happy ending, which is the third bullet point, but there is also a set of characters. There is, first of all, the heroine, the beautiful heroine, who is normally blonde, blue-eyed, fair complexion, and I will tell you why she's blonde and blue-eyed. I will tell you later. She's very thin, very delicate, and this beautiful lady is threatened by the villain. The villain is normally either Italian or Spanish or Asian. He does not belong to the same race. Okay, so the villain, the heroine, the hero. The hero is also tall, white, blue-eyed, blonde, and he rescues the heroine. So, as I told you, every Gothic novel passes from order, violation of the order, going back to the order. So the order at first is the heroine and the hero are together beautifully and happily and very content. Then the villain enters the stage and destroys the order or tries to destroy the order. Then the hero defeats the villain and the order is restored. So there is a set of characters that are always there. Now, why was I doing this with my hand? Because normally in a Gothic novel, there are a lot of secret passages, castles, ruins, dungeons, okay? If we go back to Piranesi, you see the stairs. This is exactly what happens in a Gothic novel. It is as if you were to the ground floor, then you plunged and you descended into the dungeons, which is something that physically happens in the plot of a Gothic novel. The heroine, in order to escape, always escapes into the dungeon. So graphically, physically, you see the descent, which corresponds to the violation of the order. And then when the order is restored, then you go back to the ground floor. Okay? So I put you the cover here of Vathek by William Beckford and The Monk by Matthew Gregory Lewis. And I selected these two very important Gothic novels because Vathek is set in the Orient. We don't really know which country it is, but it's called the Orient. It's an Oriental tale. Whereas The Monk is set in Spain, another Catholic country. Now, the Gothic novel has three phases because as a genre, as an anti-classic genre, it evolves. There is an evolution of that. There is what we call traditional Gothic. And the most important novel in this respect is The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole. Horace Walpole, Otranto is an Italian city, incidentally, in Apulia, in the south of Italy, a Catholic country. Now, Horace Walpole actually created the prototype, the stereotype of the Gothic novel. And he created that, publishing it in 1764 first, and then republishing it. And I will explain to you why. When he published the novel, whose setting was in the Middle Ages, in Italy in the Middle Ages, he pretended that he had, by chance, by mere chance, found an old manuscript telling the real story of the Castle of Otranto. And he tells us that the only thing that he had done was changing and translating it into English. So he had found this Italian old manuscript that he had translated into modern English. So at first, the Gothic novel was born as a fake. Okay, why is that? Because it was such a revolutionary, such a pioneering kind of novel that he was not sure about its success. It was so different from all the classical compositions that the readership was accustomed to that he didn't want to run the risk of ruining his reputation as a writer. And this is why he published it anonymous, with his preface saying that he was just the translator of the text. Now, in 1764, the success of the Castle of Otranto was just tremendous. I mean, was terrific. People loved the novel. It was so revolutionary, so new, so interesting, so engrossing, so powerful that he decided the following year, in 1765, to republish the Castle of Otranto, stating this time that he was the actual author of the text. So he was not simply a translator, but he was the author of the text. And he codified, he created the rules of the traditional Gothic by saying in the preface that a Gothic novel mixes novel and romance. Okay, so it mixes elements of realism. Actually, in Otranto, there is a castle. There is the Castle of Otranto. So elements of realism with pure elements of invention, of creation, of fantasy. Okay, so he was creating a new kind of novel, mixing novel and romance. And this was the traditional Gothic novel. Then the novel evolved. We have an evolution of the Gothic novel. The so-called Romantic Gothic, with Clara Reeve, who wrote The Old English Baron, has the most important among her novels. Now, what is the meaning of Romantic Gothic? This new Gothic mixed elements of the traditional Gothic with element of romanticism and most of all love stories. Okay, there is always a romantic liaison between the hero, the heroine, and this is very, very much developed. While it is just, a touch of color in the traditional Gothic, it becomes a staple element in the Romantic Gothic. And this was very popular, especially with women. So the Romantic Gothic was the most favorite among women readers. Then another evolution of the Gothic novel, the so-called rational Gothic, with Anne Radcliffe, The Mysteries of Adolfo. Adolfo is an Italian name and is the story set in Italy. Or another Gothic novel, which she published 3 years later, entitled The Italian. Why rational Gothic? Now, somehow Anne Radcliffe anticipates detective stories and detective fiction. She changes the Gothic novel by removing completely the mysterious elements which were present in it. So there are no more ghosts, no more apparitions, no more specters, no more things that you cannot rationally explain. Everything can be explained rationally. Even what one thinks is a ghost, it is not really a ghost, but it's just, maybe an illusion, maybe the reflex of a shadow. I mean, all the irrational elements are erased completely. And we head, with Anne Radcliffe, we head towards detective fiction and Conan Doyle at the end of the 19th century. But as I told you, a very important theoretical element which was included and the theoretical base of the Gothic novel was a very important essay by Edmund Burke entitled A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful, published in 1757. So everybody that wrote a Gothic novel actually had previously read Edmund Burke's essay. Or because before publishing it, Edmund Burke's essay circulated a lot before being officially printed. So even Horace Walpole knew the text very well. So it was an extremely popular text. And he listed all the elements of the sublime to explain what the sublime is, and all the elements of the beautiful in order to explain it. The sublime implies a reaction on behalf, on behalf of the readers. So readers react to something sublime, something that exceeds the normal proportions with astonishment. And the astonishment is exactly the feeling that whoever reads a Gothic novel has. You're astonished, okay? Another element of the sublime is darkness. In Gothic novels, darkness prevails. Everything is dark, everything is not illuminated. We have secret passages, dungeons. So darkness is typical of the sublime. Powerful figures are sublime. And Edmund Burke actually says, this is the reason why we say our dreaded majesty. So the king, who is the living embodiment of power, is sublime and is the source of astonishment. Think, for example, of George III. Everybody was terrified by him, by his power to annihilate anybody he wanted. Privations. In many Gothic novels, you find the element of privation of air, of oxygen, which is reminiscent of the black hole of Calcutta, as I told you, privations of space also, because maybe people are confined in very, very tiny prisons. So privations of food, the idea of starving is part of Gothic elements and therefore is an element of sublime. Dimensions. As I told you, whatever is sublime is whatever exceeds what our standard, normal, human eye can grasp. Sublime is the sky, for example. Sublime is the universe. And this is the reason why in many Gothic novels or novels that stem from the Gothic genre, such as Frankenstein, dimensions are important. The creature, for example, exceeds normal dimensions. He creates astonishment. He is sublime. He is dark. His complexion is sallow. He is powerful, and he deprives other people of life. And he is big, is exceptionally big. Also, the settings of Frankenstein reproduce this attention to dimensions. For example, the pole, the North Pole, where the novel opens, is a huge ground where you can see no end. There is ice everywhere. Or the setting where the creature and its creator meet again is on the Alps. The Alps are very tall, okay? So these are the dimensions of the sublime and the Gothic. Extremely wide, extremely tall, or extremely deep. And this is why many, many Gothic novels have this descent into the dungeons, like a descent into hell. The physical reaction to all of this is tension. It's like when we watch a horror movie. When we watch a horror movie, our body is tense. We have a physical reaction to that. Instead, the elements of the beautiful are absolutely the opposite. And if you think of the heroine of a Gothic novel, she embodies all the elements of the beautiful. So the villain is sublime and the heroine and the hero are beautiful. Dimensions. Think of whatever you think is beautiful. Normally for female beauty, for example, whatever is beautiful is whatever is tiny, is small, is full of grace, okay? When I teach this to my students, I always tell them, you never think of a beautiful woman if she has enormous feet or enormous hands, okay? She has to be tiny and delicate. So dimension, smoothness. So something beautiful is something smooth. So the hair of the heroine is always smooth. Her clothes are always smooth. I mean, there is this idea of even when you touch the skin of the heroine, the complexion is always fair and smooth. Delicacy, she's always fragile, and the colors are always fair and light colors. So the heroine is never dark. She's always blonde and blue-eyed for this very reason. And the physical reaction to all of this is relaxation. When you look at something beautiful, you feel absolutely relaxed. Now, Burke even established a comparison, which I put the passage here. A comparison between whatever is sublime and whatever is beautiful, which are the two elements that clash in Gothic novels. And I'm going to read it to you. On closing this general view of beauty, it naturally occurs that we should compare it with the sublime. And in this comparison, there appears a remarkable contrast. For sublime objects are vast in their dimensions. Think of the creature in Frankenstein. Beautiful ones, comparatively small. Think of the heroine. Beauty should be smooth and polished. The great, rugged, and negligent. This is how the creature is described. Beauty should shun the right line, because beauty, has got curves, yet deviate from it insensibly. The great, in many cases, loves the right line. The right line is the height, the depth, the width, like we said, okay, where you cannot see an end to it. And when it deviates, it often makes a strong deviation. Beauty should not be obscure. The great ought to be dark and gloomy. Beauty should be light and delicate. The great ought to be solid and even massive. They are indeed ideas of a very different nature, one being founded on pain, the other on pleasure. So beauty gives pleasure, sublime gives pain. And these are the two feelings that the Gothic novel tends to arise. Now, if we close the chapter of the Gothic novel and we enter another chapter of this very fertile, as I told you, period in which there are a lot of clashes and a lot of different tensions, we have the so-called graveyard poetry. So I'm trying to cover whatever is before Romanticism, the so-called Romanticism. Graveyard poets, Edward Young and Thomas Gray, with their works, respectively, Night Thoughts on Life, Death, and Immortality, and Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard. Now, they both stem from a third category, which is the idea of the picturesque. So we have the beautiful, the sublime, and the picturesque. What is the picturesque? The picturesque is something in between. It is as if I wanted to say all the classical elements of the sublime, but stripped, deprived of the idea of terror. Okay, so why the cemetery? Why the graveyard? Because the graveyard is picturesque in the sense that there are sublime scenarios, but with no anxiety, no tension, no fear. Okay, probably you are familiar with the fact that many romantic writers and proto-romantic writers used to go to the graveyard as we may go to a park. For them, the graveyard was just a beautiful place, a beautiful setting to enter into communion with our deeper self, or with the lost ones, or, where to think deeply. Okay? And going back to my beloved Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley, in actual fact, Percy Shelley declared his love for Mary Shelley, and he first kissed her in a graveyard in front of Mary Wollstonecraft's grave. So it was normal for people to go to the cemetery and relax in a way. Now, going very slightly, I mean, giving just a few hints on Edward Young and Thomas Gray, Night Thoughts on Life, Death, and Immortality is a long poem in which Young ponders on the theme of life and death, but without anxiety, without being anxious, aware of the fact that death is just a passage. And it's a moment of transition that you need to face before becoming immortal. Thomas Gray, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, the writer ponders on the graveyards that he can see in the country churchyard. He looks at the graves of many people and he says to himself, maybe these people, if they had had the financial opportunity to study, maybe they could have become the most important poets of the age. So as you can see, it is not a simple contemplation of nature, ruin, graveyard. There is also a social message in it. We need to extend, to stretch the educational opportunity for people, because there might be geniuses all over the place and we may never be aware of the fact that they exist. Another element of proto-romantic poetry is the Gothic poetry. James Macpherson and Thomas Chatterton. Both, like Horace Walpole before them, both pretended that they had found old manuscripts and that they had decided to republish the works of Ossian, Macpherson, and Thomas Rowley, in the case of Thomas Chatterton. Obviously, it was fake. They were experimenting on new ways of creating poetry, which could break the classical mold. And they were obviously afraid of the innovation, and therefore they had decided, just like Horace Walpole, to be very cautious and very wary and just test the ground before coming forth with their own name. But while James Macpherson in the end declared that Oisin or Ossian did not exist and that he had invented the poems, Thomas Chatterton's case was very different. He didn't want to reveal the fact that his Thomas Rowley was just pure invention. But he was found out. Somebody realized that he had lied. And therefore, Thomas Chatterton, who lived a very, very short life, killed himself because of that. And what you can see in the picture is a very, very famous painting by Wallace in which Thomas Chatterton's death is featured. He became a sort of romantic hero, the man who had died for his own art. Because he wanted to keep the memory of this imaginative person, this Thomas Rowley who never existed. He wanted to keep the memory of this man alive. And therefore, he couldn't bear the fact that people had realized that Thomas Rowley did not exist. That's why he poisoned himself. Then another important element that anticipates Wordsworth, Coleridge, and the revolution of the lyrical ballads is the Scottish poetry of Robert Burns and Robert Ferguson. Now, while in classical poetry, Alexander Pope, who I have mentioned before, while in classical poetry, the language was a very, very high language, elevated, the language of the upper classes, and a very literary language, Robert Burns and Robert Ferguson decided to create, for the first time, poems in Scottish dialect. because for the first time, being anti-classical, they wanted to demonstrate that even the most common language can be used for poetry. And poetry must be accessible to everybody. This is also a very revolutionary thought. So poetry does no longer belong to the upper classes, is no longer for the aristocracy. Poetry should be for every person who is capable of reading it. So this was a very, very important revolution they brought about. And also the subject changed in their poems. In Robert Burns and Robert Ferguson's poems, the subject was nature, animals, and also the correspondence between the animal world and the natural world and the world of men. I give you an example. There is a very nice poem by Robert Burns entitled To a Mouse. A mouse, okay? Nobody before Robert Burns ever thought of dedicating a poem to a mouse. Normally poems were to the Duke of, to the Countess of, to the King, to the Princess, to the beautiful lady. Instead, Robert Burns decides to dedicate this poem to a mouse. And he describes the pain the mouse feels when the plow destroys its little house, its little nest. Okay, so he finds the same correspondence, the same pain that a man would experience if his own house was destroyed. The same pain is the pain that the mouse feels. And all the poem is written in Scottish dialect. Now, before ending my talk with this age of transition, I have to talk very briefly of another important artist who created a quiet revolution in the classical world, William Blake. William Blake, who was a revolutionary artist because of his technique, because he went against the Industrial Revolution in the way that I will tell you in a minute, and because he wanted to go back to an ideal of artist that was capable of doing everything. So he was against Adam Smith, against the idea of chain production. For him, the artist had to create his own work of art from the beginning to the very end. And therefore, he used to print his poems, color his poems, and bind and then sell his books. Because for him, every product had to be unique. Now, William Blake is the most important interpreter of this age of transition, probably. He got inspiration from Gothic novels, also from Gothic times, and from the Middle Ages in general. In actual fact, his very way of creating and composing a text was inspired by the technique that were very popular in the Middle Ages. The technique was the illumination. So if you have a look at the medieval manuscript, you will always see that the first letter has a miniature inside. Okay, Blake took this idea and changed it by creating poems which are not just poems. Okay, as you can see in the slide, in the example of London, for instance, there is the poem, but there is also a drawing. And the important element in every text by William Blake is the fact that there is no hierarchy between the text and the image. In actual fact, they are complementary. Whatever the text says is either contrasted or complemented by the image. But the image is not merely an illustration that, just to make it nicer. No, the image conveys the message just as much as the text. And this technique that he used is the technique of illuminated printing. His most important work is Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. It's a collection of poems which grew with time. It was published, it was republished, it was extended again, okay? And he wanted to convey the idea that art is organic. Art is like a human being. It grows, okay? So innocence and experience are interconnected. In innocence, there are the seeds of experience. In experience, there is, just a residual but very, very important part of innocence. One cannot exist without the other. And this very concept, you can see it in the slide. Look at the picture. You see a man who is blind. We know it because of intertextual references. A man, an old man who is blind, who is led by a child. Okay, so the experience and the innocence have to go together. As I told you, his collection of poems was considered as a living creature, as organic. And this is the reason why, when he republished the poems, these poems sometimes changed place within the collection. For example, a poem that in the first publication was in the section Songs of Innocence, in the second publication was moved to Song of Experience to signify this osmosis between innocence and experience, without which men cannot simply survive, because you need to preserve the innocence in you, and in the child there are the seeds for the future. Now, I don't know, Saikat, I don't know how much time we have, because if we have a lot of time, I will comment on the poem London. If we do not have time, maybe I will wrap it up and finish. Just please tell me.
We have some time. You can
We
carry.
have
Yes,
some
yes,
time.
yes.
Okay, right. So I selected this poem among the many that I could have chosen because this is a poem of social protest that really makes us understand the clash between the idea of art of romantics and William Blake, first of them, and the idea of art for the Royal Academy of Arts. So, if you remember, the Royal Academy of Arts, because George III feared artists because they were innovative, inventive, new ideas, so they could undermine the kingdom. He wanted artists to copy, okay? Blake creates instead, invents. And in London, he doesn't simply create and invent, he criticizes the corruption of his own city and the corruption of his own king. So it was a very bold gesture on his part, which he could afford simply because everybody thought that Blake was mad. Blake was not mad, okay? He pretended to be mad so that he could speak openly, just like A Fool by William Shakespeare. But I will read the poem for you. Just let me drink a little bit. Okay, London. I wander through a charter street near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry every blackening church appalls, and a hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hairs. So this is a really, really powerful poem. Now, first of all, I would like to focus your attention on the word charter, charter. The idea of charter has in it the idea of creating maps, okay? So he is saying that London is no longer free. London is a city where maps are everywhere, where everything is conquered, where the king has to know everything. Even the river Thames is mapped, okay, is chartered, right? So he wants to convey in this very first stanza the idea of being controlled by the king and by his cronies. And then look at the way in the following lines, he wants to visually, graphically convey the idea of the alienation due to the Industrial Revolution and working in factories. Pay attention, marks of weakness, marks of woe, every cry, every infant's cry, every voice, every bed. So by repeating the same words over and over again, he wants to convey the idea that when you work in a factory, you repeat the same action and repeat it and repeat it and repeat it and repeat it. Okay, so very graphically, very visually, he wants to give you this idea of alienation. The mind-forged manacles is a concept that is typically Blakean. Blake believed that hierarchies had to be abolished. Therefore, it was very dangerous for the king, okay? But he honestly believed that hierarchies were detrimental to men. But even hierarchies within men, because according to religion, the spiritual part is the most important. According to the Enlightenment, the rational part is the most important, okay? So he believed instead that mind, spiritual side and body were all the same, and you could not establish a hierarchy between the three parts. So mind-forged manacles means that if you think that by following rationality, like William Godwin believed, if you think that by following rationality you will improve, you are wrong. You are building manacles for yourself because you are not releasing your potential. Your potential is in your mind, is in your soul, is in your body. And there is no hierarchy between the three of them. In the third stanza, it tackles the issue of the chimney sweepers. So also social protest in this respect. You know that chimney sweepers were mostly children, and they died, they were exploited, they worked very long hours. And so the hint to the chimney sweeper is interesting. And it's also interesting this oxymoronic definition of the church. The blackening church appalls. You see, there is a contrast of colors, of clash. The church is becoming black, but the church is becoming pale. So the two colors are clashing. Why? Because the church is no longer doing its job, is no longer leading the spiritual growth of people. The church was very well connected with the king. Okay, so this is social and political protest. The hapless soldiers sigh. Why? Because probably most of the soldiers who were forced to kill people, and this is the reference to the blood that runs down palace walls, most of the soldiers probably did not want to kill. Maybe they did not want to perform the actions they were forced themselves to perform. Okay, so it gives you, this poem gives you the idea of London in a chaos, where when people are anxious, where people are exploited, where people are subjugated, and even nature is subjugated. The last stanza was added in a second moment by William Blake. Originally it didn't exist. Then he added it. And also this is a very potent social message. The youthful harlot curse is the syphilis. Okay, we know that harlots, prostitutes, were an endemic disease in those days. Even if the king used to say that the morality of the kingdom was at its best, that was not the case. And prostitutes who were just derelict women who did not know how to provide for themselves in any other way. So prostitutes, youthful, because sometimes they were barely children, teenagers, they were very young, they cursed the families. Why? Because they had syphilis, and men contracted syphilis, and in turn they passed the syphilis to their wives, who in turn passed it to their children. The newborn infant's tear is because when they contracted tertiary syphilis, that is the syphilis contracted from the mother, the child actually was born blind. Okay, so he's describing a society that is corrupted, even physically, because the head is corrupted, because the king is corrupted, because all the administration is corrupted, and all they're interested in is money, profit, and chartering the streets and the river and imposing the economic logic over nature. With this, I finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Elisabetta, and as always, it was an absolute pleasure and honor to have you
Thank you
today
so
and
much.
listen to you a lecture which was so full of informations, and
Thank you.
the way you presented the various phases in that particular age, starting with the garden, and it was really very beautiful and very informative, and presented in a way which will, I'm sure, stay embedded in the minds of our participants.
Thank you so much. You're really kind.
People really enjoyed your lecture. Testimony to the fact is the plethora of messages that's there in the chat box. I will share with you the same in your WhatsApp number.
Thank you.
And
I don't know how it works now. Do I have time for questions? Yes.
Yes, we have some time, and we have some very interesting questions. I think you
Okay,
can. Uh,
where can I read the questions? Is there a
I will
chat box
I
for?
will I will communicate on the participants' behalf. I will
Uh-huh.
communicate the questions, and you please, if possible, you answer the interesting way you answer generally the questions. Uh, the first question is, why were the Gothic novel not written in American setting in that age?
Okay, now this is not exactly true. That is not written in the American setting because in the American setting we have a writer who was very well connected with Mary Shelley, who is Charles Brockden Brown. Now I can see the chat box, and thank you for so much. I want to read all your messages and your comments.
Yeah, I'll WhatsApp you.
Oh, can you do it?
Yes, yes,
Oh,
I will.
yes, please, please. So I will write the name of the writer. So Charles Brockden Brown, who wrote Gothic novels in the same period, well, slightly later actually, in the American context. And the only thing, obviously, some of the elements of the Gothic novel in Britain did not work for America, okay? Because obviously the Catholic element did not work, the Indian element did not work. So the nightmarish element in the American context was the Puritan tradition. So the Puritan heritage, because as we know, when the Puritans conquered and created in 1620 the first colony in Massachusetts, they imposed a very strict discipline and control, and therefore the Puritan ideas replace the horror effect that India and Catholic countries create in the British setting.
Thank you so much. Our next question is, as you stated, the Gothic novel celebrated everything irrational, and Walpole had set the tradition of the Gothic novel as a mixture of realism and fantasy. Now, given this, how did the rational Gothic pass for Gothic novels at all?
Okay, exactly. So this is a very good question in actual fact, because as I said to you, it anticipates detective fiction. Arthur Conan Doyle drew inspiration from Anne Radcliffe, for example. It resembles a Gothic novel, and it stems from the Gothic novel because you find the same setting, the same stock characters, the same evolution of the plot, the same development, but in the end, you can explain everything rationally. So it is a transition between the Gothic novel and detective fiction.
Thank you. The next question, can we put Frankenstein in the genre of rational Gothic, particularly?
Can we put?
Frankenstein. Mary
I,
Shelley's Frankenstein.
Frankenstein.
In the
Okay,
genre of rational Gothic, particularly.
no, no. Uh, Actually, Frankenstein is not really a Gothic novel. It's okay. You should think of the Gothic novel like the Mother. Okay, and from the Mother there are a lot of children. All right, and Frankenstein is one of them. Why is Frankenstein not a Gothic novel? Because there is no happy ending. The happy ending is mandatory in the Gothic novel. Okay, because the Gothic novel, as I told you, is a very reassuring genre. You read it and you purify yourself because you cast all your anxiety onto the novel. Frankenstein has no happy ending, and therefore it cannot be considered as a Gothic novel. It has some Gothic elements, the elements of the sublime, for example. The elements of the sublime are always there. Okay, so it draws from the sublime and from the Gothic novel, but it is not a Gothic novel. And
Thank
it
you.
is not rational. It is not rational because you cannot explain rationally the fact that the creature actually is brought back to life. This is not rational. Even though in those days they were experimenting on that. They were making experiments on reviving the corpses of those who were sentenced to death in the prison of Newgate. And in actual fact, an Italian, Giovanni Aldini, who wanted to perform this kind of technique, had to go to England and do this in the Newgate prison because in Italy it was illegal.
Thank you.
Sure.
The next question: as Vindication of the Rights of Women was written around the same time
Yes.
when Gothic novels were on the rise,
Yes.
how did the women reacted to the presentation of female characters in these novels?
Okay. Now, the Gothic novel was not regarded as high culture. Okay. It was enjoyed by everybody, but it was not regarded as high culture. Right. So women reacted like nowadays female students of mine would react to a romantic fiction. So they enjoy the fact that the hero rescues the heroine. But for example, Mary Wollstonecraft in Vindication of the Rights of Woman created a completely different female figure who was capable of providing for herself and capable of defending herself. And actually, she criticized this element of the Gothic novel, the fact that the heroine was not capable of doing things on her own. She needed the help of the hero.
Thank you. Can we say that the painting of villainous characters and the protagonist in their respective manners in Gothic novels was
Sorry, could you repeat?
perhaps, can we say,
Yes.
the painting of the villainous characters
Mhm.
and the protagonist in their respective manners in Gothic novels
Mhm.
was perhaps a reflection of racial chauvinism?
Oh, absolutely. 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 Yes, definitely. Definitely. The villain is always dark. Dark complexion, dark hair, and bear in mind, Italians, especially Italians of the South, and the Gothic novels were set in the South. Italians of the South are very dark. Okay, so yes, there is racialism involved, and talking about the children and the grandchildren of the Gothic novel, and the racial element. If you think of Wuthering Heights, if you think of the character of Heathcliff, Heathcliff has got a dark complexion and he is the villain of the story. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Thank you for the question.
Next question is, uh, although you have answered partly, but still I would like to put it across. What role did women play in Gothic literature?
Women played not a central role. Okay, they were the object of attention, not the subject. Okay, they're always objects. First of all, they are the object of the attention on the part of the villain, and then they are rescued by the hero. But they have no agency. Women are stripped of their agency.
And the last question, which you already have answered, was we have one more question, an interesting one. Can Paradise Lost be called as having traits of Gothicism?
Okay, in actual fact, it's the other way around. Gothicism drew from Paradise Lost. And if you think of Frankenstein, and I always go back to my love, Mary Shelley, Paradise Lost is one of the books that the creature finds in the forest and on which he bases his own upbringing and education. And actually, the epigraphy at the beginning of Frankenstein is from Paradise Lost. Absolutely, the idea of the fall is a staple element of the Gothic novel, and certainly Paradise Lost inspired it. So thank you so much for the question.
Well, that was the last question of the day. So it was an absolute honor, ma'am, to have you. And as things are getting back towards normalcy slowly, we hope to meet soon. You happen to stay in a country which happens to be the central attention of our Bollywood movies. So
Really?
definitely, yes, Rome plays a very significant role of in our Bollywood movies.
You know,
And
I'll tell you a joke. Tell you a joke. My colleagues now call me the Bollywood lady because I do so many things in India. So I'm known as the Bollywood colleague.
Uh, absolutely. You have
I adore it.
you
I
have
adore
a
it.
you have a I would say a fan following in India, and I think there is hardly any researcher or who keeps a close eye on various lecture series, or who keeps a close eye on these kind of innovative lectures. Everybody is aware of you and your presentations. You see, my colleague Dr. Basudra also have heard you and thoroughly enjoyed you. So I'm sure you have a mass mass followers here in India. And the next time you visit, I think you need to bring some security along with you. Because of the fan following that you have garnered over this lockdown. We are truly blessed. This lockdown has, for many a reason, has been very, very negative. But one of the few very positives has been this Zoom and this lecture series where we get to connect with each other. We get to know the knowledge, the understanding of our resource persons, and that encourages us as young teachers to extract, to inspire, get inspired from scholars like y'all, not only from the knowledge, but also it's in the evening time, 4 or 5 o'clock, I think 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock around in Italy, and you are full of energy and you are smiling at the end of the day. So that's also something that we should all learn, that at the end of the day also we should always be happy and always be energetic. It was an
Because of
absolute
my
pleasure to
Indian
have you.
guy,
Yes, Indian shy. I know. It was
the
an abs.
spices.
Thank you so much. And this is just the beginning. We hope to meet soon in various lecture series which we have planned. And I will
Thank
get
you
back
so
to you.
much.
I will again, I will again, somehow torment you with my messages because you give me that
I
much of
will be
space.
delighted.
You give me that much of space that I can express myself fully, express my participants' demands, and you completely listen to all the demands. In fact, you do more than that. So, ma'am, words are not enough. On behalf of Basudra and myself and entire team DAATH, ma'am, it was an absolute pleasure and honor to have you today. Our participants thoroughly enjoyed you and hope to see you soon, ma'am. Namaskar from India. Take very good care. Good
Thank
night.
you so much.
Good night from India. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank
Good
you.
night, participants.
Thank
Tomorrow we
you.
meet at 6:30. Thank you so much.